Today's lecture in anatomy and physiology is the spinal cord. Here's an outline of today's lecture. We will talk about cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord, followed by the external anatomy of the spinal cord. Then we will talk about the reflex arc and discuss specific reflexes. We will talk about nerve plexuses of the body. We will talk about spinal cord pathways. Let's start by talking about the cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. Now, as you can recall from one of our previous lectures, the white matter in the spinal cord is located peripherally. The gray matter is located centrally. The gray matter in the spinal cord is butterfly-shaped, like this, and there are different sections. The two main sections are the ventral horn and the dorsal horn. The ventral or anterior horn is motor. So this is your anterior horn. Your dorsal horn or posterior horn is sensory. The lateral horn is autonomic and specifically sympathetic. And you only see the lateral horn in the thoracic spinal cord. So you don't see this. This is the lateral horn, but you don't see it in all segments. And in general, the pattern you're going to realize is that anything dorsal in the spinal cord is sensory, anything ventral in the spinal cord is motor. So let's look at the spinal nerve. So this is your spinal nerve here and here. The spinal nerve is formed from the fusion of the posterior or dorsal root and the posterior of and the fusion of the ventral root. So you have your sensory component and your motor component. So your posterior or dorsal root is sensory, and your anterior or ventral root is motor. And the posterior root also contains the dorsal root or posterior root ganglion. Now let's look at the external anatomy of the spinal cord. Now this slide may seem complicated, but it's really not. The spinal cord is the information highway between the brain and the body. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, while the spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. So the CNS consists of your brain and spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system consists of the peripheral nerves. The spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum of the skull all the way down to L1 vertebrae. So your foramen magnum all the way down to L1. And you have your cervical enlargement and your lumbar enlargement. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And all of these spinal nerves receive sensory information through the dorsal root and send out motor signals through the ventral root. Some special landmarks you should be familiar with is the conus medullaris, or the medullary cone. That's the tip of the spinal cord, which is at L1. And you have the cauda equina, which is L2 to L5 spinal roots. So this is your cauda equina. And the name itself literally means horse's tail because it looks like a horse's tail. Now let's talk about a reflex arc. So the reflex arc, it bypasses the brain, and it's a way to respond to a stimulus without relying on the central nervous system. So in this case, let's look at the withdrawal reflex. You detect the stimulus by the receptor. So you touch a hot stove or a hot pan, you feel pain. The signal is sent through the sensory neuron, which is then sent through the interneuron in the dorsal root, which is then sent through a motor neuron to an effector organ, and the effector for example, a muscle, which withdraws your hand from the hot object is stimulated. So you got your sensory signal, which is detected by the receptor. The nerve impulse travels travels through the sensory neuron, sends a signal to the interneuron, which sends another nerve impulse, sends a signal to the motor neuron, which sends a nerve impulse to the effector, which is a muscle. An example of a reflex is the patellar reflex. It tests the lumbar plexus, and it's a good way to test L4. So you tap on the knee, which causes a stimulus in the muscle spindles in the quadriceps, and then you have your impulses, which travel through the sensory neuron to the interneuron, and it sends a motor signal to the quadriceps which causes that slight kick that you see with the patellar reflex. As I already said, testing reflexes is a good way to test nerve function. For example, if you want to test L4, you can use the patellar reflex that we just talked about. If you want to test S1, you use the Achilles reflex, which is demonstrated here. You tap on the Achilles tendon, and it stimulates plantar flexion of the foot. It's also known as the ankle jerk reflex. There are different nerve plexi that come off the spinal cord. One of these is the brachial plexus, and it's responsible for the sensory and motor function of the upper extremity. It gives off these named nerves to the muscles and skin of the upper extremity, the arm, and is formed by C5 to T1 nerve roots. There's a lumbar plexus, which originates from L1 to L4 nerve roots, and it gives rise to the femoral nerve, which gives motor signals to the anterior thigh muscles, such as the quadriceps and the sartorius. You also have the sacral plexus, which originates from L4 to S4 nerve roots, and it gives rise to the sciatic nerve, which is the largest nerve in the body, which provides innervation to the posterior thigh muscles and leg muscles. So provides innervation to the hamstrings and innervations to all the muscles in the leg below the knee. Now let's talk about spinal cord pathways. There you have your major motor/descendant pathway, which descends from the brain to the spinal cord to send signals to the muscles. And the major one of note is the corticospinal tract, which sends motor signals from the motor cortex, the precentral gyrus, to the spinal cord. You also have your sensory or ascendant pathways, which ascend from the spinal cord to the brain to send sensory information. And your two major pathways are your dorsal column pathway, which are responsible for touch and proprioception. And proprioception is spatial awareness or position sense. You have your spinal thalamic pathway, which is responsible for pain and temperature. Now here's your corticospinal tract. As you can see, it sends motor signals from the motor cortex down to the spinal cord. And note that the pathway crosses in the brainstem before it goes down to the spinal cord. Therefore, the motor cortex on one side of the brain sends motor signals to the contralateral or opposite side of the body. So for example, the left motor cortex sends motor signals to the right side of the body. Your sensory pathways, which are the dorsal column and spinal thalamic tract, relay sensory signals from the spinal cord up to the brain. And the fibers, they cross in the spinal cord before sending sensory information to the brain. Therefore, the motor cortex on one side of the brain receives sensory information from the contralateral/opposite side of the body. So for example, the left sensory cortex receives sensory information from the right side of the body. We're done. Thank you. Like this video. Subscribe.